were the mountain men. In the early 1800s, as the great wilderness of North America stretched unbroken from the Missouri River to the snow-crowned peaks of the Rockies, a breed of men emerged unlike any the continent had ever seen. They were called the mountain men, wanderers, hunters, trappers, explorers, and survivalists who lived where no roads reached, where blizzards buried the earth and silence ruled the nights. Drawn by the promise of furs, adventure, and the untamed freedom of the frontier, they abandoned the comfort of settlements to carve out a life in the cold, rugged heart of the wilderness. They followed rivers that had no names, climbed mountains that no map had recorded, and faced storms that could strip the breath from their lungs. The wilderness called to them like a siren, and they answered, armed with little more than flintlock rifles, axes, and the unbreakable will to endure. To be a mountain man was to exist beyond civilization's reach, to measure time not in days or months, but in seasons of snow, thaw, and survival. They were the first Americans to truly live off the land, relying on instinct, skill, and an unshakable respect for the merciless forces of nature. Every mountain man's story began with isolation. When they first ventured west, there were no settlements, no trading posts, and no clear paths through the Rockies. They faced an environment that punished arrogance and rewarded knowledge. The snowdrifts were high as cabins, rivers froze into glass, and winds howled like wolves across endless plains. Survival was not a challenge, it was a ritual, renewed every morning with each breath that did not turn to ice. These men learned to move with the rhythm of nature, to follow animal migrations, to read clouds and wind for signs of storms, to understand that survival meant adaptation, not resistance. They were hunters of beaver and elk, traders of pelts and tails, but above all, they were students of the land. Each scar on their hands, each notch in their rifle, told a story of confrontation with an indifferent wilderness that cared little for human ambition. The mountain man's appearance itself was a reflection of the life he led. Clad in buckskin stitched from deer hide, boots patched with fur, and a coonskin cap or wide-brimmed hat shielding his weathered face, he looked more like a creature of the mountains than a man of civilization. His beard was tangled, his hands calloused, and his eyes sharp with the knowledge of survival. The wilderness shaped not only his body, but his spirit. He moved deliberately, spoke rarely, and trusted slowly. The rifle slung over his shoulder was his constant companion, as essential as his knife, flint, and pouch of dried meat. When blizzards came, he knew how to dig into snowbanks and build shelters from fallen timber, creating small pockets of warmth in a sea of ice. When hunger struck, he could snare rabbits, fish through ice, and track elk through miles of frozen forest. His resilience was not born of courage alone, but of a hard, intimate understanding of nature's laws, that only those who respected the land could survive upon it. Yet life in the mountains was not merely a physical struggle, it was a spiritual reckoning. Isolation stripped away illusion. In the dead of winter, when wind roared through canyons and snow buried the world, a man came face to face with himself. There were no towns, no churches, no judges, only the endless white, the echo of his breath, and the distant cry of wolves. Many mountain men spoke later of this solitude, not as punishment, but as revelation. They felt closer to God in those frozen wildernesses than they ever had in any man-made place. The land was both teacher and adversary, cruel yet magnificent, indifferent yet divine. This blend of beauty and danger gave rise to a quiet humility, a recognition that no man could conquer nature, only endure within it. For every trapper who returned with riches, another was buried beneath the snow, claimed by avalanches, wolves, or the endless hunger of the cold. Despite the peril, word of the wilderness spread eastward like wildfire. Tales of men like Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, and Hugh Glass, legends forged in frost and blood, captured the imagination of a young nation hungry for expansion. They became symbols of the American frontier spirit, fearless, self-reliant, and relentless. But behind every legend lay a truth far harsher, that survival in the wild required sacrifice, loss, and a constant battle against the elements. The mountain men were not simply adventurers. They were the bridge between the known and the unknown, the first to map, name, and endure lands that would later become part of America's heart. They paid the price of exploration with their comfort, safety, and sometimes their lives. To understand the mountain men is to understand humanity's oldest struggle, the desire to live freely against nature's vast indifference. Each shelter they built, each fire they lit beneath the falling snow, was an act of defiance and reverence at once. Theirs was a life that balanced on the knife's edge between existence and extinction, a daily negotiation with the wilderness that both sustained and threatened them. They were not heroes in the traditional sense, nor villains of exploitation. They were men who sought meaning in struggle, identity in hardship, and freedom in the most unforgiving places on earth. As the sun set behind the icy peaks and smoke curled from their hidden camps, the mountain men sat by their fires, staring into the flames that mirrored their own endurance, solitary, flickering, and fiercely alive in a world that sought to snuff them out. When winter swept down from the northern peaks, the mountains changed from majestic to merciless. The cold did not simply chill the skin, it pierced bone, it silenced life. It turned breath into ice before it could leave a man's lips. For the mountain men, this transformation was the true test of survival. The wilderness they had chosen to conquer now turned against them with a power both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Each snowstorm arrived like an army of ghosts, blotting out the sun, erasing trails, and swallowing sound until even one's heartbeat felt distant. In these moments, the difference between life and death was not bravery or strength, but knowledge, how to read the signs of a coming blizzard, how to find shelter where there seemed to be none, and how to keep the faint spark of life alive when the world itself froze solid. The mountain men called it the White Death, and for good reason. A single night, unprepared, could end a life. A single mistake could mean vanishing beneath snow that would never melt until spring, when the sky turned gray and the air grew still. They knew what was coming. Animals vanished, the forest grew silent, and the light itself dimmed. In that silence, every man's heartbeat grew louder, echoing against the walls of the wilderness. The experienced trappers acted fast. They gathered dry wood and moss for tinder, dug snow trenches, and built makeshift shelters from branches, bark, and the frozen ground. Others, caught unprepared, relied on instinct and sheer will. They huddled beneath overhangs or inside hollowed tree trunks, wrapping themselves in fur and praying their fire would not die. Many learned to build what they called a snow burrow, a hollow carved into a drift, where the insulation of the snow itself trapped body heat and prevented frostbite. In such icy tombs, they lay through the night, listening to the howling wind that carried the voices of lost men. When dawn came, if it came, they would crawl out, faces frostbitten, eyes watering, grateful for the cruel miracle of survival. The cold had a way of humbling even the strongest. Fingers that could load rifles and skin beavers became stiff and useless. Beards froze solid, boots turned to ice, and breath condensed into white frost that hung in the air like ghosts. They learned to move slowly, methodically. Haste was death in freezing weather. Sweat was the enemy. It froze beneath clothing, turning warmth. Fire was salvation, but it was also a gamble. In blizzards, smoke vanished into the storm. Sparks died before touching kindling, and men cursed through chattering teeth as their last match broke in half. For every fire that flickered to life, there were a dozen that died in the snow. Some trappers carried coals wrapped in moss inside. Their packs, a living ember from an earlier flame, their only hope, rekindling warmth in the endless cold. The mountain men's relationship with the cold was paradoxical. It was both their tormentor and their teacher. Over time, they learned the rhythm of the winter, when to travel, when to hunker down, when to listen to the voice of the wind. The blizzards were not just weather. They were entities, vast and alive. The old trappers spoke of them as if they were gods, merciless, ancient, and deserving of respect. Never curse the storm, one mountain man was known to say, for she don't hear words, but she knows fear. This philosophy kept them alive where others perished. They didn't fight the cold. They learned to live within it. Snow became their roof, ice became their wall, and frozen rivers became their roads. In time, the wilderness itself became their home, harsh, silent, and sacred. But not all survived. The mountains claimed their share without remorse. Men disappeared without trace, leaving only broken traps and half-buried camps as reminders. When the snow melted in spring, travelers would find skeletons near streams, rifles still by their side, frozen in eternal vigil. Others lived but carried scars that told their stories, blackened fingertips, missing toes, frost-bitten ears. Yet even these survivors returned to the mountains year after year, drawn by something deeper than gold or fur. The thrill of facing the wild, of testing themselves against nature's rawest form. They spoke of nights when the northern lights shimmered across the sky, painting colors over frozen peaks while they huddled by firelight. In those moments, fear and beauty merged into something profound, a feeling that life itself was burning fiercely against the infinite cold to the mountain men. The blizzard was not merely an enemy, it was a rite of passage. Every storm endured carved strength into their souls. They learned to read snow the way others read books. Its texture, its sound, its scent on the wind. Fresh snow meant movement. Dry snow meant deathly cold. They could tell the temperature by the crunch beneath their boots, could sense when an avalanche was near by the stillness in the air. These instincts became their armor, forged not from metal, but from memory and pain. The blizzard was merciless, but it also purified. It stripped away weakness, arrogance, and hesitation. What remained was the essence of survival, raw, primal, and unbreakable. When the storm finally passed, the world it left behind was silent and pure. Trees bent under the weight of snow, rivers slept beneath ice, and the sun returned like a promise. The mountain men emerged from their shelters, faces pale, clothes stiff, and hearts pounding. Every breath felt like rebirth. The world smelled of pine, frost, and smoke, the perfume of survival. They knew the mountain had spared them, not because of luck, but because they had listened, learned, and endured. And as they trudged onward through the gleaming white wilderness, their tracks marked not just a path through snow, but through history, the silent footprints of men who had stared death in the face and refused to bow. Long before the mountain men became legends of the American frontier, they were students of survival, apprentices in the cruel classroom of the wilderness, where every mistake could mean death. The first lesson was always the same: nature owed you nothing. The snow-covered peaks did not care for courage, and the wind did not pause for prayer. To live in the mountains meant to unlearn everything that civilization had taught: comfort, predictability, and dependence, and replace it with instinct, precision, and relentless will. For newcomers venturing west in search of fur, fortune, or freedom, the first snowfall separated the dreamers from the dead. Many arrived with fine rifles and clean clothes, but by the end of their first winter, only those who could think like the wilderness itself would remain alive. The veterans, the true mountain men, taught survival not with words, but through silent example. They knew how to read signs invisible to the untrained eye: a shift in wind that hinted at a coming storm, the silence of birds that warned of a predator nearby, the faint indentation in snow that revealed the path of elk or wolves. They taught that the world spoke constantly, if only a man could learn to listen. The second lesson was movement. Never stay exposed when the wind turns north. Never camp in a valley where cold air sinks. And never travel without knowing your return path. When storms rolled in, these lessons became the difference between waking and never waking again. Every step through knee-deep snow was calculated. Every decision weighed against the memory of men who had vanished into the white. Fire was not merely warmth, it was life itself. But even fire demanded respect. The mountain men learned to build it low and steady, shielded from the wind by rocks or snow walls. Too large a flame could melt overhead snow and collapse a shelter. Too little heat and frostbite crept silently into fingers and toes. They used dry bark, pine needles, or pitch wood, scraping shavings with frozen hands until sparks caught. The first flicker of light in the storm was more than flame, it was hope. Around those small fires, wrapped in furs, stiff with ice, they learned another truth: solitude burns colder than the snow. Companionship became an unspoken code of survival. Even the most solitary trapper knew that a partner's presence could mean an extra heartbeat through the night. In the wilderness, a man's life was not measured in wealth or pride, but in how many nights he could keep that fragile flame alive. Shelter was a test of imagination. With no cabins or walls, the men turned the land itself into their refuge. They hollowed snowbanks into insulated caves, leaned branches against fallen logs to create lean-tos, and sometimes cut into frozen slopes to form windbreaks. Every shelter was temporary, built not for comfort but endurance. The sound of the storm outside, the howling wind, the cracking of branches, the distant rumble of shifting snow, became part of their dreams. They slept in bursts, half awake, their instincts alert even in rest. For a mountain man, there was no such thing as safety, only a delay in danger. When dawn came, the first thing they checked was the air, a breath drawn deep to test its bite. If the frost stung the lungs too sharply, they knew the temperature had dropped below survivable limits. Then they moved, not out of choice, but out of necessity. Stillness killed. Motion meant warmth, and warmth meant life. Hunger, too, was a constant teacher. Trapping lines froze solid. Rivers disappeared beneath thick ice, and game grew scarce. A man learned to eat whatever could be found: roots, bark, even leather straps, boiled soft. The lucky ones caught snowshoe hares or ptarmigans, snaring them with cord made from sinew or hair. Some learned the trick of melting snow in their mouths, slowly, to avoid lowering body temperature, while others carried lumps of frozen fat or pemmican, a mixture of dried meat and berries that could keep them alive for weeks. Every bite was earned through pain and patience. Hunger carved their faces into masks of endurance, their eyes sharp and hollow, reflecting the firelight with the same wild gleam as the wolves that hunted them. Yet, amidst all this hardship, there was a strange and fierce beauty to survival. The men spoke of the way moonlight glistened on untouched snow, of nights when the stars seemed close enough to touch, of the quiet peace that came after the storm passed. They learned to respect the rhythm of the land, to travel by dawn, rest at midday, and move again at dusk. Their bodies hardened, their minds sharpened, and their senses expanded until they could feel the weather before it came, smell snow in the air, and sense danger in the silence. Survival was no longer an act of desperation. It became a way of being. The mountain man was not just a human among beasts. He was part of the wilderness itself, as integral to the mountains as the wind and the trees. Over time, their instincts turned into legends. Campfire stories spread eastward, tales of men who survived three-day blizzards, wrestled grizzlies, or crossed entire mountain ranges alone. While civilization saw them as wild and reckless, those who had shared their camps knew better. They were masters of discipline, control, and patience. Every mountain man carried invisible scars, not from battle, but from lessons learned in silence. The wilderness had stripped them of everything unnecessary and left behind only the essential: endurance, humility, and respect. And when they finally descended from the high passes in spring, covered in frost and glory, they carried with them not just furs, but wisdom, the understanding that to survive was not to fight nature, but to move with it, breathe with it, and become part of it. So, the first lessons in the snow were not written in books or passed in words. They were carved in frostbite, hunger, and solitude. Each man who entered the frozen frontier carried his own story of struggle and awakening. The blizzards, the hunger, the bitter winds, they were the teachers that shaped legends. In the end, the mountain men did not conquer the cold. They learned to belong to it, and in that belonging, they found a freedom no warmth could offer. The freedom of knowing that even in the harshest silence, a man's spirit could burn brighter than the storm. When the wilderness turned brutal and the blizzards howled through the canyons like a living beast, the mountain man's first thought was not of food or fire, it was of shelter. The storm could strip a man of life faster than hunger or wolves ever could. And in that frozen world, A well-built refuge was more valuable than gold. Every log cabin, every snow cave, every crude lean-to was a silent act of defiance against the mountain's wrath. These men were not architects by training. They were craftsmen by necessity, sculptors of survival who built with whatever the land offered. The snow, the timber, the rock, all became tools in the hands of men who refused to be broken. A shelter was not just a place to sleep. It was a line drawn between life and oblivion, between the howling storm and the fragile pulse of human endurance. The first type of refuge a mountain man learned to build was the simplest, the snow shelter. When a blizzard descended without warning, there was no time to search for timber or stone. They would find a snowdrift, dig into its heart, and carve out a hollow just large enough to sit or lie in. The irony was cruel. The very substance that froze them could also save them. Inside those icy cocoons, the temperature could rise above freezing, insulated by layers of snow that trapped body heat. The men lined the floor with pine boughs or animal hides, sealing the entrance with their packs to block the wind. They called these snow burrows, and in the dead of winter, they were sanctuaries. It took instinct to know which drifts were stable and which would collapse. And it took experience to survive the long, breathless hours inside, where the air was thin, and every exhalation formed frost on the ceiling. In that silence, the storm outside became a distant heartbeat, and the man inside, motionless and alone, waited for the world to forgive him, enough to let him out. But when there was time and materials, the mountain men built shelters that were more permanent, rough-hewn log cabins that stood as monuments of endurance. These were not the polished homes of the frontier. They were fortresses of survival, built with sweat, frost, and instinct. Finding a location was the first decision, near running water, sheltered from the wind by trees or cliffs, and elevated just enough to avoid floods from melting snow. Using their axes, their most trusted companions, they felled straight pine or fir logs, stripping them of bark and cutting them to uniform length. With practiced rhythm, the logs were stacked in a crisscross pattern, each corner locked by precise notches carved with the axe blade. The sound of steel biting would echo across the valleys like a heartbeat of defiance. Every strike was a statement. I will not die here. The roof was layered with branches, moss, and hides, sealed with mud or clay when available, to block drafts and snow. The door was a crude slab of wood, often hung with leather hinges or rope, and the windows were covered with greased paper or animal skin to let in faint light while keeping out the cold. Inside, the air smelled of pine, smoke, and sweat. A stone hearth dominated one corner, where a carefully tended fire burned day and night, its smoke twisting upward through a hole in the roof. Over that fire, pots of stew simmered slowly, rabbit bones, roots, and bits of jerky floating in melted snow water, a feast by wilderness standards. The walls creaked under the pressure of the storm, and snow hissed as it hit the roof. But inside there was warmth, the soft crackle of fire, and the low hum of a man breathing life into the mountain's silence. Sometimes they built lientus, temporary shelters made by leaning branches or logs against a fallen tree, covering them with pine boughs and hides. These quick constructions could be raised in an hour and abandoned the next morning. The men slept close to their fires, one side of their bodies burning with heat, while the other froze in the open air. They learned to turn slowly through the night, roasting and freezing in equal measure. In deep forest or high passes, they used natural formations, caves, overhangs, hollow trunks as part of their shelters, blending their architecture with the mountain itself. There was no blueprint, no standard. Every shelter was a conversation with the land, an improvisation shaped by weather, wood, and willpower. Tools were few, but hands were many. The axe, the knife, the small adze, these were extensions of the man himself. With them, he could fell a tree, shape a beam, skin a deer, or carve a notch for a roof. Every cut was made with precision. Waste meant weakness. Nails were rare, so they lashed joints with rawhide or wedged pegs of wood. The cabins were crude, but strong enough to withstand years of storms. When the wind howled, the walls shuddered but stood firm. When snow fell, it piled thick on the roofs, insulating rather than crushing. And when spring came, the thaw revealed cabins blackened by smoke, but unbroken, the signatures of survival etched into the wilderness. Inside those shelters, the men found fleeting comfort. They sat by firelight sharpening blades, mending traps, or writing notes in weathered journals. The glow painted their faces in amber, deep lines cutting across eyes that had seen too much cold and too little rest. Outside, wolves howled and wind screamed, but the cabin walls turned chaos into rhythm. The mountain men talked to their fires as if to friends, muttering promises, curses, and prayers. Sometimes they carved symbols into the walls, simple marks of existence, reminders that even in the vast emptiness, a man had once lived here, fought here, and refused to die here. For these men, building a shelter was not only about protection, it was about belonging. To shape the land was to declare to the wilderness, "I am part of you, but I will not vanish." Each cabin, each burrow, each hastily built lean-to became a testament to resilience, human fingerprints left on the untouchable face of nature. And when they finally moved on, leaving behind those lonely huts buried in snow, the shelters remained like bones of memory scattered across the wild. To stumble upon one in later years was to feel the echo of their struggle, the ghost of a man who had once carved warmth out of a frozen world. When the mountains sank into darkness and the blizzard winds rose like ghosts through the canyons, there was only one thing that stood between life and death: fire. To the mountain men, it was not merely light or heat. It was existence itself, the single, fragile miracle that held back the eternal cold. A fire in the wilderness was a heartbeat, a prayer, a promise whispered into the void. It was the symbol of man's defiance against the mountain's indifference. Every spark struck from flint and steel was a cry of determination. Every flame that took hold was a victory carved out of frost and wind. For men who lived months without seeing another soul, the glow of a fire was more than survival. It was companionship. The crackle of burning wood filled the silence that would otherwise have swallowed them whole. Building and maintaining fire in the high wilderness was an art, a ritual learned through suffering. Matches were rare, and damp air made tinder, stubborn and unyielding. The mountain men carried small pouches of dry moss, bark, or pitch pine in their packs, treasures as precious as gold. Flint and steel were their weapons against the cold, and striking a spark in the wind required both skill and faith. Sometimes they used gunpowder from their rifles to ignite damp wood, a dangerous trick that often ended in singed eyebrows and laughter too brittle to be joy. In the worst storms, when snow fell so thick it smothered flame before it was born, they would hollow a pit into the ground, shield it with stones, and build the fire there, feeding it with breath and hope. They learned to burn slow and low, to let embers grow strong before daring to add larger logs. The rhythm of survival was set by the fire's pulse, steady, careful, alive. There was a language to fire that only experience could teach. The color of the flame, the scent of smoke, the sound of popping wood, each told a story. Blue fire meant clean heat. Yellow meant damp wood. Black smoke meant danger. A good fire was not too large, for a roaring blaze wasted fuel and drew attention to predators, or worse, to other desperate men. Instead, the wise trappers built small, disciplined fires that burned with focused strength, their light barely reaching the edges of camp. They arranged stones around it to reflect heat inward, dug trenches to channel smoke, and placed hides near the flame to dry for the next day's journey. Around that flicker of light, they lived entire lives, cooking, mending, dreaming, and remembering. At night, the cold became a living thing. It crept into boots, stole through seams, and bit at the edges of every blanket. The men learned to sleep close to the fire, rotating slowly through the night, one side scorched, the other frozen. Too close, and sparks would burn holes in furs. Too far, and frost would take the breath from their lungs. They learned to judge distance by instinct, by the feeling of the air on their skin. Sometimes they woke to find their fire gone, buried. Under drifting snow, their shelter plunged into absolute silence. In those moments, panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. With stiff fingers and aching bones, they would dig out the ashes, coaxing life from the smallest ember. A single glowing coal was enough to save a man, fed carefully with bark and breath until the flame rose again like dawn breaking after a long night. Fire also brought danger. In wind or confined spaces, flames could turn traitor, consuming the very shelter meant to protect. A careless spark could set fur or wood alight, leaving a man to watch helplessly as his meager world turned to smoke. The smell of burning hides was the smell of despair. That is why mountain men treated fire as a living partner, unpredictable, temperamental, demanding respect. They fed it just enough, guarded it fiercely, and never, ever turned their back on it. Even in sleep, their minds remained half aware, tuned to the sound of crackling wood. If the fire whispered wrong, they woke instantly. Fire was their constant companion, their fiercest ally, and their deadliest threat. But beyond warmth and light, fire held something sacred. On long, solitary nights, the men would sit before it and stare into its shifting heart, seeing memories in its glow, faces of lost friends, voices of the plains, the shape of home flickering in the flames. They spoke to it, not as to a tool, but as to an old friend. "Keep me till morning," some would murmur before closing their eyes, the fire's glow dancing across their weathered skin. There was a strange peace in those nights. The world outside was endless and indifferent, but within that small circle of warmth, a man could pretend, just for a while, that he belonged somewhere. When dawn came, the embers glowed faint red, the last heartbeat of the night. The mountain men would stir, rake the ashes, and gather what heat remained. They knew how to revive a dying fire, feeding it with thin twigs and dry breath until the flame stood tall again. Then, as they packed their gear and loaded their rifles, they would scatter the ashes, hiding all sign of their passing. To leave a fire burning unattended was sin. To leave one cold and unburied was disrespect. The wilderness taught them that balance, every flame borrowed from nature, must be repaid with care. In the end, the fire was more than survival. It was the mountain men's mirror, fierce, fleeting, and alive only so long as one fought to sustain it. They saw in it the reflection of their own lives, brief sparks against the eternal dark, fragile yet magnificent. To build fire in the middle of a blizzard was to declare that life still mattered, that even when the wind roared and snow crushed the trees, a man's will could still burn brighter than the storm. And when the night was longest and the cold most cruel, the fire's glow became a quiet reminder that hope, like flame, could survive even the deepest winter if guarded well. In the wild, where silence ruled and mercy was rare, the mountain men carried their world not on their backs but in their hands. Their tools were more than instruments, they were extensions of their will. Symbols of survival forged from iron, leather, and bone. Every scar on a handle, every notch on a blade, told a story written not in ink but in blood, sweat, and frost. When the snow fell heavy and the trees groaned under ice, these tools became lifelines, the thin line separating life from oblivion. There were no machines, no luxuries, only raw ingenuity and an iron resolve to wrest life from the wilderness. The axe, the knife, the rifle, the trap, these were not mere possessions. They were pieces of the man himself. Without them, he was nothing but prey. The axe came first, always the axe. It was the tool that built the shelters, split the firewood, and cleared paths through the frozen forests. The mountain men treated their axes with reverence, sharpening the blades daily, wrapping the handles in oiled leather to prevent cracking from the cold. When a storm approached, the rhythmic sound of an axe striking wood echoed through the valleys, a heartbeat of survival, echoing in sync with the rhythm of the mountains themselves. The axe was weapon, hammer, and sculptor's chisel all in one. With its edge, a man could fell a pine tree, shape a log into a beam, or cleave a frozen carcass. And when enemies came, men or beast, the axe became something darker, a last defense wielded with desperate strength. The mountain men believed the axe carried a spirit, not of violence, but of endurance. To lose it was to lose a piece of the soul. Then came the knife, smaller, quieter, but no less vital. Its edge carved life out of death, skinning game, cutting meat, shaping snares, or mending clothes. It was the most personal of all tools, worn close to the body, always within reach. The knife's blade reflected the firelight like a silent companion during long nights alone. Many men named their knives, spoke to them, passed them down as heirlooms. A knife was trust-made steel. When blizzards buried the world and food grew scarce, that knife cut through frozen hides, whittled traps, and carved spoons from bone. It was never idle, never forgotten. In moments of danger, when a rifle jammed or a trap failed, it was the knife that decided whether a man lived or died. The rifle was both power and burden, It gave the mountain man the reach to hunt elk across distant ridges, to protect himself from wolves, and to assert a fragile dominance in a world that owed him nothing. Every shot fired echoed from miles, a sound that could mean meat for the pot or trouble nearby. Powder and lead were precious, so each bullet was measured, each trigger pull deliberate. They cleaned their rifles with care, oiling the barrels and checking the flints by firelight. Some carried old Kentucky long rifles, others the new percussion caps of the 1830s. But all understood the same rule: never fire unless you must. To waste a shot was to invite hunger. The rifle wasn't just a weapon, it was a promise, an equalizer against nature's indifference. Traps, though, were the true symbols of mountain life. Ingenious, silent, patient, they worked while men slept. Steel jaw traps, snares made of twisted sinew, deadfalls of stone and wood, each designed with precision and an understanding of animal instinct. The trappers studied the land like scholars. They could read tracks in the snow as if reading a letter from the earth itself. The depth of a hoofprint, the angle of a paw, the faint drag of a tail. They placed traps at narrow passes, along riverbanks, and beneath fallen logs. Every trap was a wager with the wild, a contest of intelligence between man and beast. The prize was fur, meat, and survival. The risk was frostbite, hunger, or worse, returning to find one's own hand, caught in the jaws of fate. But what truly set these men apart was their ingenuity. They learned to repair anything with nothing, patching boots with sinew, crafting snowshoes from willow branches and rawhide, and fashioning fishhooks from bent nails or bone. They built sleds from stripped bark and tied them with leather thongs, using them to drag supplies across snowfields. Their shelters evolved with each season. Log walls thickened with moss, chimneys reshaped for better draft, roofs angled to shed the heaviest snow. When faced with blizzards that lasted for days, they melted snow in pots over dim embers, rationed their powder, and kept their minds sharp by carving figurines or tally marks on the walls. Necessity sharpened creativity until it became instinct, a kind of artistry born from desperation. Even the simplest object had purpose. Flint stones doubled as cooking slabs. Bare bones became sewing needles. Sap from pine trees sealed leaks in canoes. Nothing was wasted. The wilderness gave little, and the mountain men learned to take only what they needed. They lived by a rule, unspoken but absolute: waste nothing, respect everything. Their tools were symbols of this philosophy: practical, simple, durable. They repaired them endlessly, using wire, hide, or wood, never discarding a blade unless it broke beyond hope. To a mountain man, a dull axe or broken knife was a wound, a reminder of mortality sometimes. When the storms passed and the nights grew still, they would sit before the fire, laying their tools out beside them like trophies of endurance. The firelight would dance on the metal, reflecting a history of struggle and survival. They'd polish their rifles, sharpen blades, and oil handles, not just for maintenance, but as ritual. Each tool carried memory of hunts survived, shelters built, and winters conquered. In those moments, the line between man and tool blurred. The steel remembered what the flesh could not forget. As spring approached and the snows began to melt, the mountain men's tools showed the story of the season. handles worn smooth by calloused palms, traps rusted by cold rivers, rifle stocks darkened by sweat. Each mark was proof that they had endured. In a world where nature tested every weakness, these tools were more than equipment. They were declarations of will. The wilderness might have been vast and unforgiving, but the man with an axe, a knife, and a spark of determination stood as proof that even against the wildest odds, humanity could carve its place in the cold heart of the mountains. In the white silence of the high country, hunger was the truest predator. The mountains looked serene from a distance, endless waves of snow under a silver sky. But for the mountain men, it was a battlefield. The cold didn't kill as swiftly as starvation, and every day without food sharpened both the senses and the desperation. When the storms cleared and the wind fell still, the hunt began, not for sport, not for pride, but for survival. Every footprint in the snow was a promise of life or a warning of death. The men knew how to read them like scripture. The spacing of hooves told how fast the animal had moved. The depth of the print revealed how recently it had passed, and the faint warmth beneath the surface whispered how close it still was. In this frozen world, instinct was worth more than bullets, and patience was sharper than any blade. They hunted in silence, breath steaming in the air like smoke from hidden fires. The sound of a rifle bolt clicking could echo for miles, scaring prey into eternity. So the mountain men moved like shadows. They followed elk through narrow valleys, tracked snowshoe hares across icy creeks, and sometimes went days without seeing a single creature alive. But when they did, when the faint shape of a deer appeared through the mist, or when they heard the crunch of hooves over crusted snow, time itself seemed to pause. Every heartbeat counted, every breath was deliberate. The hunter raised his rifle slowly, waiting for that single perfect moment when muscle, wind, and instinct aligned. A shot fired too soon wasted powder. A shot fired too late wasted life. The mountain man learned to wait until his own pulse calmed, until he could feel the mountain's rhythm in his veins. Only then would he squeeze the trigger, one steady motion, one whisper of defiance against hunger. The sound shattered the silence, echoing through valleys like thunder from another world. Birds scattered, snow fell from branches, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with pine and frost. Sometimes the shot hit true. The animal staggered, fell, and the man would breathe for the first time in hours. He approached slowly, whispering a quiet word of thanks. In that moment, hunter and hunted shared a strange bond, both victims of the same merciless wilderness. The meat meant survival. The fur meant warmth. Every kill was both triumph and tragedy, a trade written in blood and necessity. The mountain men respected the lives they took. They wasted nothing. Bones became tools, sinew became thread, hides became clothing. Nothing returned to the earth untouched. But not every hunt ended in victory. There were days when tracks vanished under fresh snow, when animals sensed danger long before the man, when the wind turned suddenly and carried his scent miles ahead. Hunger clawed the gut like fire. Weakness made the rifle shake, made judgment blur. Some men followed phantom trails, convinced they saw movement in the distance, only to find shadows or snow-laden branches. Others chased too far, too long, until night fell and the storm returned. Many never made it back. Their bones, found months later, told stories of exhaustion and desperation. Rifles still loaded, eyes forever open toward a sky that gave nothing. The true masters of the frozen hunt learned humility. They knew that the mountain itself was part of the chase, its ridges guiding prey, its winds betraying man, its silence teaching patience. They learned to use snow not just as obstacle, but as ally, masking their scent and muffling their steps. They would smear ash or dirt on their faces, wrap themselves in fur to blend into the white expanse, and crawl through icy ravines for hours until within range. Sometimes they used snares instead of bullets, setting traps along animal paths, knowing the hunt could take days. They learned to think like the creature they pursued, to move when it moved, to pause when it listened. In doing so, they became part of the wilderness, indistinguishable from it. Every hunt carried risk beyond hunger. Wolves followed the same trails, their howls echoing across the ridges, signaling both competition and danger. Bears, roused by hunger themselves, would attack without warning, drawn by the scent of blood. The snow concealed cliffs, rivers, and death itself beneath its white veil. One misstep could mean a fall into icy water, a broken leg, and the slow, cold fading of life. Yet, despite all this, the mountain men hunted, not because they were fearless, but because fear had become part of their survival. It sharpened them, reminded them that every breath was borrowed time. When the day's hunt was successful, the reward was not joy, but relief. They butchered the kill quickly, their hands stiff and red against the white snow, cutting deep before frost set in. The meat was packed into hides, tied with sinew, and carried back to camp, heavy, sacred weight across their shoulders. Smoke would soon rise from distant cabins as fires crackled and meat sizzled over open flames. The air filled with the smell of life returning, of hunger quieted. They would sit by the fire, silent, the flames reflecting in their tired eyes. No celebration, no laughter, just quiet gratitude. The kind that only those who have stared into the abyss can feel at night. The memories of the hunt lingered. The snow outside glowed blue under moonlight, and the wind whispered through the pines. The men would dream of the creatures they'd tracked, of hooves on snow, of eyes glinting through mist. They dreamed not of victory, but of survival, of the delicate balance that kept man and beast bound together in the endless rhythm of the wilderness. And when dawn came, they would rise again, check their rifles, and step once more into the frozen unknown. For in the mountains, the hunt never truly ended. It was not a choice, it was life itself. In the frozen silence of the frontier, there was no law but survival, and no mercy but nature's. The mountain men lived each day knowing that they were not alone in their hunger. The same wilderness that fed them also fed others, wolves, bears, and beasts whose eyes glowed like embers in the darkness. To the mountain man, the line between hunter and hunted was thin as a breath in the cold air. Every night, as firelight flickered against the log walls of his shelter, he could hear the low, haunting song of wolves drifting through the pines. It was not just a sound, it was a warning, a reminder that in these mountains, dominance was fleeting. The men who roamed these lands were not kings, they were survivors, tolerated by a world that could erase them without a trace. The wolves came first, silent, cunning, and patient. Their howls began miles away, faint and lonely. But as night deepened, they grew closer, weaving through the wind like whispers of death. A lone trapper could tell the number of wolves by the tone of their call. One deep voice meant a scout, many meant a pack. The mountain men learned quickly: never leave meat outside, never wander unarmed after dusk, and never underestimate a wolf's intelligence. They hunted in perfect harmony, moving through snow so quietly that even seasoned men failed to notice until it was too late. Sometimes they trailed a man for miles, unseen but always near, testing his resolve, waiting for weakness. Around campfires, the trappers told stories of men found with rifles frozen in their hands, eyes wide open toward the forest where yellow eyes still lingered. Wolves didn't just kill, they judged. And yet, there was respect in that fear. The mountain men admired the wolves' discipline, their loyalty to the pack, their balance with nature. Wolves killed to live, no more, no less. The trappers saw something of themselves in those beasts, both bound by hunger and solitude. There were moments when man and wolf locked eyes across a clearing. No rifle raised, no growl uttered, just silent acknowledgement. In those moments, both seemed to understand the mountain belonged to neither of them. It belonged only to the cold. If wolves were the shadow, the bear was the storm. Massive, unstoppable, and unpredictable. A bear encounter was a trial few forgot, and fewer survived. The grizzlies of the Rockies could stand taller than a man on horseback, their claws long as knives, their breath steaming in the frozen air. They slept through winter's peak, but hunger drove some to roam, even in the depths of snow. A bear's roar could shake the air itself, echoing off cliffs like thunder from the earth's heart. Mountain men carried their rifles loaded with heavy lead balls for this reason alone. They knew the rule: one shot, maybe two, was all you got. Miss, and the mountain would bury your bones before morning. Encounters came without warning. A man might round a ridge, rifle slung loose, only to find himself staring into the dark eyes of a bear tearing through the carcass of his hard-earned kill. In that instant, time shattered. The bear would rise, the air filled with its growl, deep and primal, vibrating through the snow. The man's hand would tremble, the rifle barrel glinting with frost. Some fired and lived. Others froze, the world going white as claws, struck faster than thought. Those who survived carried scars, not just on their flesh, but in their dreams. Around campfires, they whispered about Old Scar, the monstrous grizzly that had survived a dozen bullets, the ghost of the wilderness that could not die. Whether legend or truth, the fear it inspired kept every man sharp. But not all predators were seen. The wilderness itself hunted in silence: avalanches, freezing rivers, hunger, and madness. A man could vanish without a sound, swallowed by the white. The mountain men understood that even when the wolves slept and the bears hid, death still watched from every shadow. Yet they never hated the wild. They respected it. Each encounter with danger reminded them of their smallness, their place in the grand, indifferent order of nature. They called it the price of being alive. And still, they fought back. They set traps for wolves, built spiked barriers around their camps, and carried torches into the dark. Some trappers hunted the beasts that hunted them, their furs fetching high prices in frontier towns. But the more they killed, the more they understood. the mountain would always send another, larger, stronger. They began to see the wilderness not as an enemy, but as a teacher, one that punished ignorance and rewarded wisdom. Those who learned its lessons endured. Those who didn't became stories whispered by the fire. One such story spoke of a man named Garrett Boone, who once tracked a wolf that had been killing his trap's game. He followed it for 3 days through storm and silence, across frozen lakes and pine-shadowed ravines. On the 4th night, he found it not one wolf, but 7, circling him in the snow. They didn't attack. They just watched, yellow eyes glowing like coals. Boone raised his rifle, but didn't shoot. Slowly, he lowered it, backed away, and left them to the wild. When he returned to camp, he said only one thing: "You don't kill what already owns the mountain." In those words lay the truth of every mountain man's heart. They were not conquerors. They were guests, trespassers who earned their place one frozen night at a time. Each encounter with predator and storm, each scar and narrow escape, reminded them that survival was not dominance, it was harmony. To live in the wild was to accept the terms of a world that did not care for pride or pity. It was to walk among wolves and bears, not as master or victim, but as brother and rival, bound together by the same endless hunger to endure. When the wilderness finally gave, it gave grudgingly, as if testing whether man was worthy of its gifts. For weeks, a mountain man might live on scraps, dried berries, or frozen strips of old venison. His ribs showed, his strength faded, and his voice turned rough from cold air and silence. Then, suddenly, fortune shifted. A snare caught a snow hare, a bullet struck true, or the river broke just enough for fish to return. It was never a feast by luxury's measure, but to a starving soul, it felt like a miracle carved out of frost and desperation. The mountain men learned early that every full belly carried the memory of 100 hungry nights. The wilderness taught them gratitude the hard way. The feast began not with abundance, but with fire. They would strike flint on steel until sparks caught the dry pine bark, coaxing a flame that hissed and grew like a living thing. Smoke spiraled upward, carrying the scent of pine resin and damp earth. Around that flame, the world felt briefly conquered. They roasted meat on sharpened sticks, the fat dripping into the snow with a hiss that sounded almost holy. Steam rose, mixing with breath, and for a moment, life returned to their faces, the frost melting into sweat. They chewed slowly, savoring each bite. Hunger had made philosophers out of men who could barely write their names. They spoke of how every meal was a message from God, or the mountain itself, whispering, "You've earned another day." But feasting was only one side of the coin. The other was emptiness, the endless scarcity that defined frontier life. There were months when the traps stayed empty, when snow buried every track and rivers froze thick enough to shatter dreams. A man could go mad listening to the silence of an untouched trapline. He'd walk 4 miles, check every snare, find nothing, and then come home to a cabin that creaked under the weight of snow. Hunger clawed at the edges of his sanity. He'd start rationing 1 strip of jerky a day, melted snow for soup, pine bark tea when desperation grew. The men who survived learned strange diets, boiled leather, roots bitter as ash, and sometimes when the mountains turned truly cruel, nothing but faith. Yet it wasn't just the body that starved. The soul did too. Loneliness was a hunger no meat could fill. In the silence between storms, mountain men spoke to the fire, to the trees, even to the ghosts of the land. They swore they heard voices in the wind, not madness, but the mountain talking back. Some carved faces into wood to have company. Others sang songs to the stars, their voices cracking in the thin air. In those long nights, the wilderness stripped them bare, leaving only what was essential: strength, humility, and the will to see another dawn. Still, they adapted. When food was scarce, they turned to the land with reverence. They learned which berries didn't kill, which bark could be boiled, which moss could stop bleeding. They stored fat in bear hide bags, smoked fish until it was hard as stone, buried meat under snowbanks like nature's own freezer. The smartest among them didn't just take, they planned, they balanced. They understood that greed meant death. If a man killed more than he could use, the mountain would take it back one way or another, through frostbite, avalanche, or pure bad luck. So they learned moderation from necessity, sustainability before it had a name. When food was plenty, they shared, not out of kindness, but out of survival logic. A full man alone was a dead man. Wolves smelled meat from miles away, and other trappers, starving, could turn desperate. So around fires, food became truce. Men who might have killed each other over territory broke bread together when the blizzard howled. In those moments, the mountain men rediscovered something civilization had long forgotten: unity without words, peace without treaties. It was survival's version of brotherhood, born of frost and fear. But nothing lasted. The feast always faded, the meat always ran out, and hunger always returned. It was the rhythm of the wild: eat, rest, starve, endure, repeat. Some men couldn't take it. They abandoned the mountains, descended to towns, trading their freedom for comfort. Others stayed, unable to live anywhere else. They said the silence had become their companion, the cold their truth. They no longer feared hunger. They accepted it as part of themselves, a reminder that life meant struggle. Those who endured became legends. Old trappers told stories of winters where they survived on nothing but snowshoe hair and willpower, of storms that lasted a month, of men who vanished and returned in spring with eyes like glass and hearts carved from stone. They weren't heroes, they were proof that humanity could adapt to anything, even a world designed to erase it. And when spring finally came, when the first thaw cracked the rivers and the first bird sang above the melting snow, the mountain men stood quietly, not rejoicing, but remembering. They buried the bones of the beasts that had fed them, repaired their shelters, and watched the world turn green again. They didn't smile. They nodded, knowing it was only a brief truce before the next storm. The mountain had tested them, and they had survived, not by conquering it, but by listening, learning, and respecting its unspoken law. Take only what you need, give back what you can, and never forget who's in charge. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the world gold and red, the mountain men sat by their fires, chewing the last scraps of dried meat, watching smoke curl into the endless sky. Hunger would return, storms would come again, but for now, they had warmth, breath, and another story to tell. And in the cold heart of the wilderness, that was everything. In the vast loneliness of the frontier, where silence pressed against a man's ears like weight, companionship was not luxury, it was survival. The mountains devoured the careless, but they spared those who learned the unwritten law of brotherhood. For mountain men, trust was not given lightly. It was earned through fire, hunger, and shared danger. A man's worth was measured not by wealth or name, but by how he stood beside another when the snow closed in and death whispered through the pines. There were no contracts, no signatures, only glances exchanged in the storm, silent nods by the campfire, and the sacred act of watching another's back. In those frozen wilds, trust meant life. Betrayal meant bones left for the crows. Partnerships often began not with friendship, but with necessity. A trapper alone could not haul enough pelts, could not fight off raiders, or survive the endless blizzards without someone to share the burden. So two strangers would meet at a trading post or along a frozen river and decide, without much talk, to walk together into the unknown. At first, they spoke little words, wasted breath, but soon silence became language. They learned each other's habits, one man's rhythm when cutting wood, the other's patience while setting traps. They split their rations evenly, even when one had done less work, because in the mountains, fairness was not kindness, it was insurance. You fed your partner because tomorrow you might need him to drag you out of the snow. The mountain men lived by a simple creed: never take from another what you can earn yourself. Never leave a man to die alone. It was a moral code, forged not by preachers, but by the cold. Around the campfire, they shared stories of those who had broken that rule: thieves, deserters, and liars who took supplies and left their partners to freeze. The mountains remembered such men. Their bodies were found months later, half buried in snow, faces twisted as if they'd met judgment itself. To betray another in that world was not just sin, it was suicide. But loyalty, too, came with a price. There were moments when hunger, greed, or fear cracked even the strongest bonds. The wilderness tested friendship like iron in flame. One man's desperation could turn to madness. One wrong decision could make brothers into enemies. At times, betrayal wasn't born of cruelty, but survival. One man taking the last of the food because both couldn't live. When the thaw came, the survivors carried that guilt like a wound that never healed. They didn't speak of it, but the silence between them told the truth. And yet, there were also stories of loyalty that defied the cruelty of the world. Men who carried their partners through storms, refusing to abandon them even when death seemed certain. Men who fought wolves barehanded to protect another's life, or gave up their last bullet to save a friend's chance at escape. Such acts weren't born from nobility, they were instinct, the same primal force that drove wolves to protect their pack. The mountain men had become, in their own way, a brotherhood of beasts, bound by survival, strengthened by shared hardship, and guided by an honor that no law could define. At trading posts scattered across the frontier, rough cabins filled with smoke, furs, and the stink of whiskey, the brotherhood widened. Trappers, native hunters, freed slaves, and ex-soldiers all met under the same roof. Equals for once, in a world that cared nothing for names or nations. Deals were made in gruff voices over mugs of hot coffee, arguments settled with fists or silence. There was no prejudice here, only the measure of a man's skill and his word. A liar could make one trade, never to. A man's reputation was his currency. and one broken promise could exile him forever from the network that kept him alive. But where there is trust, betrayal always lurks. Whiskey loosened tongues and tempted hands. Some men betrayed partners for pelts, others for gold, and some for nothing more than the cruel satisfaction of survival at another's expense. There were tales of men who waited for their partners to sleep, then vanished into the dark with their rifles and provisions. Others led ambushes against their own, trading loyalty for a bounty. And when they were caught, for they always were, the mountains gave no mercy. Justice came quietly, a pistol under the stars, a shallow grave in frozen ground, a whispered warning to others. Despite the darkness, the code endured. Every generation of trappers passed it down. Trust slow, test hard, but once earned, never break it. They called it mountain honor, and it was worth more than any coin. Some men traveled hundreds of miles through storms to deliver a dead partner's gear back to his family, refusing reward. Others risked their lives to avenge betrayals no one else would remember. They did it not for fame, but for balance. The belief that the mountains themselves watched and remembered every deed. Over time, these bonds shaped legends. There was Hawkeye Morgan, who carried his dying friend 50 miles through snow, losing 3 fingers to frostbite, but never letting go of the man's hand. There was Silent Tom, who avenged his brother's murder, then vanished forever into the wild, leaving only a note that read, "The debt is paid." And there were the nameless, countless souls whose loyalty was written not in books, but in the quiet of snow and the flicker of shared fires. In the end, trust was the last currency left to them. When food ran out, when bullets were gone, and when death felt close enough to touch, all a man had was the one standing beside him. That was the truest wealth the wilderness offered. Not gold, not fur, not fame, but a shared heartbeat in the storm. And when they died, as all mountain men eventually did, it was said that the wind carried their names through the valleys, whispering them like hymns, reminding the living of the code that kept them human when the world had turned to ice. Trade was the lifeblood that pulsed beneath the skin of the wild frontier. The mountains gave men furs, meat, and hides, but it was at the trading posts that these things transformed into life itself. Bullets, flour, whiskey, coffee, salt, and a few hours of warmth among voices that spoke the same language of hardship. After months of silence, the sound of a bustling camp or a trader's hammer was music. The smell of tobacco and wet leather clung to the air, and the crackle of a fire mixed with laughter, lies, and the sound of deals being struck. For the mountain men, these posts were both salvation and temptation. They came not just to trade goods, but to trade solitude for a taste of humanity. Every man entered those wooden cabins, carrying the same weight, the spoils of his struggle. Bundles of beaver pelts, fox hides, and otter skins swung from his shoulders like trophies of war. Each pelt represented a night spent freezing in the snow, a near miss with a bear, or a week without food. When the trader examined the furs, feeling their softness between calloused fingers, the trapper's heart pounded, not from pride, but from fear. A bad bargain could cost him his next winter. The trader always held the upper hand. He had the supplies, the walls, the scale. The mountain man had only his labor and his trust. Yet even knowing this, he returned again and again, drawn to the faint warmth of civilization like a moth to a dying flame. Inside, the world was loud. Men shouted, cursed, and laughed through cracked teeth. The air was thick with pipe smoke and the sweet sting of whiskey. Stories flowed faster than truth, tales of rivers filled with gold, of new valleys untouched by man, of fortunes waiting beyond the next ridge. But beneath the laughter lay tension. Every man knew that trust ended where profit began. A fair trade today might turn to betrayal tomorrow. Fights broke out easily. A wrong glance, a false weight on the scale, or the hint of cheating was enough to spark chaos. Knives flashed, blood spilled, and by morning, someone new was buried outside the post. His name, already forgotten, for some trade became addiction. The feel of coins in hand, the taste of whiskey after months of hunger, it was intoxicating. Men who once hunted for survival began hunting for wealth. They risked more, ventured deeper, and sold their souls to the mountain's promise. They called it fever, the same madness that drove gold seekers and gamblers. A man could lose everything chasing one more beaver, one more deal, one more drink, and yet, no matter how much they earned, they always returned to the mountains with the same hunger in their eyes, not for money, but for the wild freedom it represented. Temptation took many forms. Whiskey was the most dangerous. It burned warmth into the veins, but stole reason from the mind. In the dim glow of trading posts, many deals were sealed with liquor instead of honesty. A man might trade half his pelts for a bottle, drink it before sunrise, and wake with nothing left but regret. Others fell to lust, brief encounters with women who lived on the edge of civilization, offering company for a night and vanishing before dawn. Some left the mountains behind entirely, chasing the illusion of comfort, only to realize that the world below was colder in its own way. They missed the silence, the stars, the pure clarity of struggle. Civilization dulled them. The wild had defined them. The most dangerous temptation, though, was greed. The mountain men were not saints. They were survivors, and survival often demanded cruelty. Some began stealing traps, claiming others' catches as their own. Others ambushed lone trappers on remote trails, their greed cloaked as necessity. It was said that the first time a man betrayed another for furs, the mountains wept, the snow turned red that spring, and wolves howled for 3 nights straight. But even so, the hunger for more spread like a fever. Where once stood brotherhood, now came suspicion. Camps grew quieter. Men kept their rifles closer, their sleep lighter. The mountains, once sacred, became battlegrounds of ambition. Yet, amid the chaos, there were still those who remembered the old code, the unspoken rule that the mountains watched. They traded fair, shared food with strangers, and warned others of danger instead of exploiting it. These were the ones who lasted longest. Greed might fill a man's pouch, but honor filled his soul, and in the wilderness, the soul mattered more. Those who held to fairness found allies even among rivals. A good reputation could save a life when the snow turned deadly. When another trapper saw your tracks and decided not to take your supplies. In the frontier, decency was currency, and it bought time, trust, and sometimes redemption. Trade, in truth, was never about goods. It was about balance. Every pelt given was a piece of the mountain's life. Every coin earned was borrowed time. The trappers understood this, even as they cursed the traders who cheated them. They knew that civilization and wilderness were two ends of the same rope. Pull too hard on either, and everything unraveled. The trading post was their bridge between two worlds, and they walked it like men crossing a frozen river, cautious, steady, knowing that one wrong step could send them plunging into the cold. When the deals were done and the whiskey ran out, they packed their mules, tightened their coats, and turned back toward the peaks. The laughter of the trading post faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of snow underfoot. The wilderness welcomed them back with silence, indifferent yet familiar. The coins in their pockets jingled softly, hollow music in a world that didn't care for gold. As the fires of the post disappeared behind the trees, every man felt the same truth settle in his chest. Civilization was a place to visit, not to belong. Out here, among the mountains and the wind, temptation lost its voice, and the only price that mattered was the one a man paid to stay alive. The storm came without warning. 1 hour, the sky was clear and pale. The next, it turned black with fury. The wind screamed through the pines like a dying thing, tearing snow from the ground and hurling it in every direction. Inside the storm, the world disappeared, white above, white below, and death somewhere in between. 2 men trudged through that blizzard, their faces wrapped in scarves, their rifles slung over shoulders, heavy with frost. They had been partners for nearly a year, brothers not by blood, but by the unspoken oath of survival. Together, they'd fought wolves, trapped beavers, and shared every hardship the mountains could conjure. But hunger changes men, and in the white silence, trust can crack like thin ice. That their supplies were gone, their traps empty. For 3 days, they'd eaten nothing but melted snow and a few bitter roots. The storm had trapped them in a frozen canyon, miles from their cabin. They'd argued over direction, over what little food was left, over who should have shot straighter when they'd missed the elk. Small words turned sharp, sharp words turned cruel. That morning, when the wind rose, neither spoke at all. The silence between them was heavier than the storm itself. By nightfall, they found shelter, a hollow beneath a fallen tree. They built a weak fire, its glow trembling against the dark like a dying heartbeat. The snow piled higher outside, muting the world. One man, William, sat closest to the flame, his face hollow and eyes sunken from hunger. The other Pike sat across from him, sharpening his knife slowly, the blade catching the light like lightning. The sound was steady, rhythmic, too calm for the storm around them. "We're out of wood," William muttered. Pike didn't answer. He just kept sharpening. Sparks from the fire rose between them, tiny suns in a world of white. William stared at his partner. Something had changed. He could feel it, that quiet calculation, that dangerous calm that came when desperation became decision. Pike had been restless all day, glancing at William's pack, at his rifle, at the last few strips of dried meat hidden inside. Trust, once unshakable, now flickered like the flame between them. "You've been watching me," William said finally. His voice was hoarse, but steady. Pike looked up slowly, his eyes empty of warmth. "Ain't no use pretending," he said. "We ain't both walking out of this canyon." The words fell heavy as the snow outside. For a long moment, neither moved. The fire cracked, the wind howled, and somewhere in the distance, a tree snapped under the weight of ice. William's hand crept toward his rifle, slow as the falling snow. Pike saw it. He smiled, a hard, cold thing. "Don't," he warned softly. "You shoot, and we both die. You know it." William froze. The firelight danced across Pike's face, casting long shadows that made him look like something carved from the mountain itself. "We could wait it out," William said. "Storm will pass. We'll find the river." Pike shook his head. "Storm don't matter. Hunger'll kill us before it clears. One of us eats, one of us lives." Then came the silence, long, heavy, suffocating. William's heart hammered in his chest. He looked into Pike's eyes and saw nothing human left, only the reflection of the fire and the cold glint of steel. The knife flashed. William moved first, grabbing his rifle and swinging it like a club. The blow knocked the knife from Pike's hand, but the man didn't fall. He lunged forward, tackling William into the snow. The fire spilled, sparks flying like shattered stars. They wrestled in the dark, rolling over the embers, their breath ragged, the sound of grunts and snarls lost to the blizzard's roar. The struggle was brutal, wordless, not between friends, not even between enemies, but between two animals cornered by fate. Pike's hands closed around William's throat. William clawed at his face, his nails tearing skin. The snow turned red where they fought. At last, a shot echoed through the canyon, deafening. Final. The sound rolled through the storm, bounced off cliffs, and vanished into the void. When the silence returned, only one man breathed. Pike knelt in the snow, shaking, his rifle smoking in his hands. William lay still, the wind already covering him in white. For a moment, Pike didn't move. He stared at the body, at the man who had been his brother, and then looked away, unable to bear it. He dragged the pack from William's shoulders, took the remaining food, and turned toward the storm. But the mountain was watching. Hours passed. The blizzard didn't ease. Pike staggered through knee-deep snow, each step heavier than the last. He tried to eat, but his hands shook too badly. Guilt burned hotter than hunger. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper his name. Every shadow behind the trees looked like William's ghost. When dawn finally came, he collapsed near the frozen river. The world was blue and silent. The storm had cleared, but there was no warmth left in the sky. His rifle slipped from his hands, half buried in snow. His breath came shallow, uneven. He thought of the nights they'd shared, the laughter, the trust, all gone in a single moment of fear. By the time spring found that canyon, both men were gone. The thaw revealed their bones side by side, their gear scattered between them, as if the mountain itself had made them equal again. Trappers who passed through months later whispered that the place was cursed, that at night, when snow fell heavy, you could still hear two voices arguing in the wind. Forever trapped in the moment where brotherhood broke, their story became legend among the mountain men, a warning, a mirror. It was said that every man who chose to walk the high trails alone carried a little of Pike and William within him, the trust, the fear, the hunger, and the thin, breaking thread between them. Because, in the end, betrayal in the mountains was not about greed or evil. It was about survival, the cruelest, most human instinct of all. And the mountains, as always, took no sides. They simply watched, silent and cold, as man proved once again that even in the wildest wilderness, the most dangerous creature was himself. Ek-high 1,000-word cinematic paragraph main Likagaya section, full emotion, history or poetry, key a blend. As the 1840s rolled into the horizon, the mountains began to grow quieter. The trails that once echoed with gunshots, laughter, and the calls of trappers now lay silent beneath endless drifts of snow. The wild frontier, once a living beast of chaos and freedom, had begun to fade beneath the march of civilization. Steamships roared down the rivers where canoes once drifted, towns grew where camps once smoked, and the scent of pine and powder gave way to the sharp tang of iron and coal. The age of the mountain men, those wandering kings of the wilderness, was ending. Yet their stories lingered, whispered by the wind that still haunted the peaks. It was said that when a man stood alone in the Rockies at dawn, he could still hear their echoes, the crunch of boots on snow, the creak of leather, and the faint, ghostly murmur of laughter carried through the cold air. The last trappers did not vanish all at once. They faded one by one, like stars at sunrise. Some left the mountains behind, drawn toward the promise of towns and trade, where they could spend their final days telling tales to wide-eyed children who'd never seen a grizzly. Others died where they'd lived, quietly beneath the trees they loved, their graves marked only by the sound of the wind. They were relics of another age, men out of time. Civilization had little use for wanderers who spoke the language of rivers and storms. The world below moved faster now. Gold rushes, railroads, factories. But in the heart of the mountains, time still moved slow. Like a frozen stream, many of those who descended found that the world they returned to no longer fit. Their hands, built for rifles and axes, trembled when holding cups in crowded taverns. Their ears, tuned to silence, ached from the noise of streets. They missed the loneliness they once cursed. The wilderness had become their home, and without it, they were strangers everywhere else. Some grew bitter, drunk on nostalgia and whiskey, mumbling about the old days when a man could walk for weeks and never see another soul. Others tried to adapt, trading pelts for plows, rifles for hammers, but deep down, they carried a sadness that never left. They had tasted a kind of freedom the world no longer offered, and it haunted them like a ghost they could never chase away. The mountains themselves seemed to mourn their passing. Forests were cleared, rivers dammed, and paths widened for wagons. The wild places shrank, inch by inch, under the weight. Yet, in the highest peaks, where snow never melted and the air still carried the scent of pine and smoke, the spirit of the mountain men endured. Travelers spoke of finding old traps, rusted in streams, of broken cabins hidden beneath moss, of carved initials on trees that had outlived their makers. Sometimes, at night, the wind would whistle through the pines in a strange rhythm, like the tune of an old trapper's whistle. Some said it was just the wind. Others knew better. Those who studied the frontier years later wrote about them as if they were legends, half history, half myth. They called them rugged, brave, wild men who carved their names into an untamed world. But the truth was deeper. They were not heroes or villains. They were survivors. They had lived by instinct, fought by necessity, and dreamed only of seeing another sunrise. The land made them hard, but it also made them free. And that freedom, once lost, could never be replaced by comfort. Civilization built walls. The mountains built men. The difference lay not in where they lived, but how they lived. One behind fences, the other beneath the open sky in the evenings. When the sun dipped behind the peaks and turned the snow to gold, the mountains would seem alive again. The air would shimmer, and for a heartbeat it felt as if time had turned back, as if somewhere, deep in the timberline, an old campfire still burned. The ghost of a trapper stirred it with a stick, humming an old song, his dog curled by his side. His eyes, clear and distant, scanned the horizon, watching for dawn. He didn't belong to history. He belonged to the wild itself, eternal, untamed, free. The frontier's silence was not death, but memory. The wilderness was not gone. It had simply withdrawn, waiting for those rare souls brave enough to seek it again. And even now, centuries later, that spirit lingers. Every hiker who loses their way in a storm, every hunter who feels the cold breath of the wind whisper against their neck, every traveler who stands alone on a mountain ridge and feels small yet infinite. It's the ghost of those first mountain men, watching, smiling, reminding us that the land was never truly conquered. The story of the mountain men is more than history. It's a heartbeat that still echoes through the land. Their courage built no monuments, their names carved no cities, but their legacy is carved into the earth itself, in the scars of rivers they followed, in the trails they cut, in the dreams of every man who still looks to the horizon and wonders what lies beyond. They were the first to stand face to face with the wilderness and call it home. And though time buried their bones beneath snow and silence, the mountains remember. Every gust of wind that brushes across the ridges carries their song, rough, lonely, and pure. The wilderness does not forget its own.